Good evening.
It worked.
It works. On behalf of UAF Summer Sessions and Lifelong Learning, I'd like to welcome you in the room and those of you via live stream to this evening's Discover Alaska lecture. My name is Janet Taylor, and I'm part of an organization for educators called Delta Kappa Gamma. Members of our organization will be introducing the Discover Alaska speakers each week. At UAF, we acknowledge the Alaska Native nations upon whose ancestral lands our campuses reside. In Fairbanks, our Troth-Yeda campus is located on the ancestral lands of the Dene people of the lower Tanana River. This year's all these Discover Alaska lectures on Wednesday are presented by UAF College of Indigenous Studies faculty members. Tonight we will hear from Teisha Simmons, Interim Dean of College of Indigenous Studies, who will discuss cultivating wellness through traditional healing. Now I have practiced this. In her language, her name is Danaka Nagako. Is that correct?
My Danaka name is Nagako.
Your Danaka name is Nagako. Okay, I didn't practice hard enough. Hello and welcome, Nagako. Teisha holds a BA in psychology and an MA in clinical community psychology, both from UAF. Teisha is an advocate for empowering Alaska Native and Indigenous people to heal from historical and intergenerational trauma. In her free time, Teisha enjoys volunteering in the areas of substance abuse prevention and street outreach, traditional healing, language and song revitalization, and hosting elder gatherings. So, at this point, I'll turn it over to you, Teisha. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if this is on. I think we have to turn it on. I need to turn the mic on, right? Both of them? Testing, okay. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining me this evening and allowing me not to just talk to a wall. Not gonna lie, I was a little afraid I was like, are people gonna come out at 7 p.m. on a beautiful Friday or Wednesday evening in Fairbanks in the summertime? So thank you all for being here and sharing this space with me and this topic. It's a really meaningful topic to me and a very sacred topic to me. I'm going to approach my talk tonight as a story. It's my family's story. I'll share some information and facts also, but more or less I'll take you on a journey just of my own life and my family's life, and I think you'll be able to pull some insights about traditional healing from that and reflect on it and apply it however you see fit or support it however you see fit. So I just want to take a moment and read my introduction in my language, and I always take to heart what I used to feel a bit ashamed when I would read my introduction because I couldn't fluently say it. And Grandma Eliza Jones, she always told me that, she said, even if you learn one word and you say it wrong, you're still saving our language. So I'll do everything I can at the level I can. So Teisha Simmons sa uza notali den hatsan sa danslet minil gadza tayalsad tati denada conten hatsen etsalan Fairbanks lesta bitsi hata aneslan ina Marie Simmons bauza ita James Waldau bauza rela satsi ka Sydney Huntington yeth Angela Huntington yeth Jenny Huntington rela. So what I said is, my name is Teisha Simmons. My family comes from the Yukon and Kaikuk River communities of Galena, which is Notaliden, Kaikuk, Manilgadzata, and Huslia, Tati, Danatakonten. I live in Fairbanks and work here at UAF on the Troth-Yeda campus at the College of Indigenous Studies. My parents are Marie Simmons, who lives here in Fairbanks, and the late James Waldau, who came from Northern California. My grandparents are the late Sydney Huntington and Angela Huntington of Galena, and the late Jenny Huntington of Kaikuk. I also just want to take a moment and do a land acknowledgement as well. Thank you for the one you provided. But when I acknowledge the land that we're on, and wherever you are, if you're not here with us, those of you who are on Zoom, if you just want to kind of relax in your space, those of you who are in the room, get comfy in your seats. So often we race to meetings or events, and we're late getting there, and we're just like, okay, I made it. We're just like, okay, I'm here. And we're going to check it off our list that we made it to the talk, right? And we don't just allow ourselves to kind of settle in and just settle into the land and the space we're in. But really, I want to just take a moment and ask you to settle in, because I want you to just imagine with me that these hills and the Chena River have been hearing our songs and languages for 10,000 years. Like, how incredible is it that such sacredness has been in this space that we're surrounded in? Like, I love the thought of my ancestors being along the river, harvesting, gathering, praying, governing, all of those things right outside our door for centuries. So I just want to acknowledge the Lower Tanana people, and really the people of Chena Village. For those of you who may know or have known the late Howard Luke, he lived at Chena Village and opened up his camp for a lot of educational opportunities. He actually tried to convey it over to the university, but it was during a very difficult budget time, so we weren't able to make it happen. But Howard Luke really wanted Chena Village to remain a place where people came to live, learn, and practice their cultural ways. So I just want to honor his caretaking of this area as well. Another thing that I would like to acknowledge is that traditional healing can be difficult to talk about. I am in my own journey of talking about traditional healing. I want to give great respect to those people and groups that are not talking about traditional healing, and I want to honor they're not talking about it. I want to honor those who are practicing healers, and I want to honor those of us who are learning and growing and researching traditional healing and learning every day. So I do just want to acknowledge that it is a difficult topic and really needs to be cared for in a really special way, because for a long time our people were told that our traditional healing ways were evil ways. And so there's a lot of just muscle memory, I guess, that comes with me talking about it, because I grew up feeling shamed to talk about it. And so I'm still kind of getting comfortable talking about it, but I share because of what it's done in my own life and the good I've seen it do for myself. So I just want to acknowledge that it is difficult to talk about. And then I also want to acknowledge that there are different definitions of what traditional healing is. This is not the lecture to come to if you want to know all things traditional healing according to one group of people even. This is all things traditional healing according to what Teisha Simmons has been able to research and understand and practice and learn and be surrounded by. So I just want to put that out there, as well as that different individuals and tribes have varying definitions and understandings of what traditional healing is, and are at various levels of talking about it openly or not. So I just want to acknowledge all of those things. And then if you'll change the slide for me, please, Layla. Can I have some of my tea, please? Oh, sorry, I forgot to tell you I was ready. Have some of my tea. So I do just want to share, go ahead. I do want to share South Central Foundation's definition of traditional healing. South Central Foundation has had a really strong traditional healing clinic for some time. They've got everything from a traditional plants garden to traditional tribal doctors to traditional healers, talking circles, talk therapy, all delivered out at their traditional healing clinic. Yeah. Yeah, no worries. So they've had a pretty comprehensive traditional healing clinic for some time. I'm not a beneficiary at South Central Foundation, so I never really knew much about it, didn't really understand much about it. What I knew throughout my life was that we didn't talk about traditional healing, and other than that, I didn't know anything about it. That was probably until about 15 years ago or so. So I just wanted to share this definition because I think it gives a really good, well-rounded definition of what I also see as traditional healing. I do think that one piece that's missing in there is maybe a community piece or maybe an environmental piece, our relationship to the land, but I think it's also covered in different areas in that definition as well. So I would like to really just take a moment to acknowledge as well the healers who have allowed me into their own spaces, the healers who have worked on me for the last 10 years or so, and who share with me and continue to do this work, sometimes strongly supported and sometimes not supported at all. And so to talk about traditional healing, I kind of have to rewind and give you some context and just share my own personal life story with you so that you can understand where my understanding of traditional healing and how it relates to wellness all tie together. So I'll start that here in this next slide. So I was born in 1977 in the middle of the pipeline era that we've all heard so much about. I was primarily raised by a single mom. I don't remember my father being in the house at all. That's my sister and I in the top left-hand corner, and my mom with us. My grandmother was in our home a lot. She was probably in our home more than she wasn't, and so I grew up with her just always being there with us. My mom was a single mom, so I grew up watching her do all these things like pull out our entire carpet, and I'd come home from school and she'd be like, "Oh, we're gonna put in a carpet today." And I'd be like, "I'm just 8 years old. I don't know how to put in a carpet." And she's like, "Well, we're gonna do it." And so myself and her and my 13-year-old sister, we put in our carpet and somehow made it happen. And to this day, that has instilled something in me to almost an unhealthy bit of I can do anything at times, that sometimes I shouldn't do those things just because I can. And so I grew up just really with an incredible life. My mom was like super mom. She was the cookie baking, costume making, went to every event, just the most present mom. We had a very safe house. Our house was a home where people would come to escape abuse of various sorts. And my house was just always safe. I always felt so safe. In fact, my house was so comfortable growing up that I intentionally designed my home now today, just like my mom had our house, because it's so comforting to me. I said, I want people to come in my house and just feel like they're safe and they can take a nap. And people always say when they come into my house, they say, "Oh, I just want to come in and take a nap." And it's because I really grew up in such a safe, comforting home. My grandmother was there a lot of the time, like I said. I had the luxury of her raising me part-time because my mom was a health aide. So my mom would be gone for 2 to 4 weeks at a time. We grew up going to potlatches and fish camp in the summertime with my grandparents. I'd get thrown on a dog sled every now and then, scared that those dogs were not going to lead me in the right direction, but somehow they always brought me all the way across the Yukon River and back without me knowing what to do if they went awry or what to do if I fell off. I just hoped I could hang on long enough to make it back to Galena if I did fall off. But it was just a really, really beautiful life. And despite having a really, really beautiful life in my home, we all know that there were many social statistics surrounding Alaska Native people at that time, and still today. There are many statistics surrounding social issues. And I grew up seeing many of those issues play out in my community. I grew up seeing a lot of binge drinking, not just binge drinking. My community was amazing, first of all, you guys. Like, we had $1 million views looking at that Yukon River. We had elders that watched out for us wherever we went. Like, we could go out at 8 a.m. and come home at 2 a.m. We were safe no matter where we were, and someone always knew where we were, like always. I mean, we were everybody's child when we were in the village. Our village is incredible. Such a strong, incredibly beautiful place. Also experienced a lot of issues, right? So I grew up seeing a lot of binge drinking. I experienced losing people to suicide pretty regularly. It was a natural way to lose people in my life. In fact, when I was 17, I got a phone call once that somebody had passed away, and I was shocked that they had passed away, but when I learned that they had died by suicide, I wasn't surprised at all. And it took me about a year to realize that I should have been shocked that they died by suicide because they were a very young person. I shouldn't have been so accepting that that was a natural way for someone to pass. But because I had grown up seeing so many people die by suicide, it just was not a shock factor to me anymore. It was almost an acceptable way to pass, like a cancer. And so I saw a lot of addiction. I saw violence in homes when I would spend the night out, just a lot of issues. And so even though I was very protected in my home, those things, I did pick them up, right? And so go ahead and go to the next slide. I started picking up these types of beliefs and behaviors as well. So that top left-hand corner picture, that's me right before my car accident. At about this age, I had been drinking heavily already. I had been smoking marijuana. I was pretty much, the best way I can describe it is that I was the teenager that none of the parents wanted their teenagers to hang out with. Pretty much everybody wanted me out of town, out of their hair. I was making my way there. I was gonna go live with my aunt and uncle so I could try to start fresh again. But I also at this time was establishing my identity and who I was, right? So I knew I went to colleges. I knew that, my grandma spoke at the Baskin. I knew we honored our elders. I knew I gave up my chair for my elders. I knew a handful of Native words, but I didn't really know what it meant to be at the Baskin or Alaska Native. And also at this time, like any teenager, I'm trying to just figure out who I am as a human being, right? So who am I as this, developing young adult, and who am I as an Athabascan woman? Like, I wasn't even thinking about who I was as an Athabascan woman. Like a fish in water, I just was who I was in the village. Around this time, we had also moved to Fairbanks off and on as my mom followed employment opportunities. And it was there that I really, for the first time, really began to feel ashamed of who I was as a Native person. I would hear racist remarks. I experienced a lot of privilege here in Fairbanks, I want to say, because I was non-Native enough looking that people didn't know I was Native unless I let them know. And I didn't let them know. And to this day, I try to reconcile that I had shame for who I was. And so I would hear comments very openly because people didn't realize I was Native. So they would make a lot of comments about drunk Natives and the Native problem and comments that, you don't want to hear about who you are at the age of 13 or 14. I would also hear microaggressions from teachers or people in schools where they might say things like, wow, you're so well-spoken for a Native person. Just comments like that where it was like, I think you're complimenting me, but I'm not really sure. And all of those things really impressed upon me about what it meant to be Native. And what it meant was, don't talk about it and don't be proud of it because you're gonna bring a target on your back. And no 14-year-old wants a target on their back in a big, scary school in a city they're not familiar with. And so I just went with it. My poor choices landed me in this wheelchair. That photo there in the middle is when I was in the Seattle Children's Hospital. I was in a car accident with my sister and 2 cousins. We were out joyriding with my grandparents' car when we shouldn't have been, and ended up in the ICU for 30 days, and then in Seattle for 6 months, and then came back to Fairbanks, ended up going back to school, fell in love with it, however, went right back into many of the behaviors I was partaking in before of drinking, smoking cigarettes. You can see I have a tube in my neck in that middle photo. I had that tube in my neck for 4 years. It was pushing air into my lungs, and I was still smoking cigarettes while I had a machine pushing air into my lungs. I was just making very bad choices, but I love learning. I could keep a 4.0 and be a very bad teenager at the same time. So then I ended up at UAF. Everything looked really great from the outside, right? There's me in the photo up there, getting my degree. I had my own apartment. I got off the breathing machine. Things looked good. I was volunteering. If you look from the outside, things looked really well. It was around this time that I also got the phone call about my friend that had passed or had died by suicide. But it was here at UAF that something happened. Something really good happened. Because at this time, even though I was graduating with honors and I was doing really well and I was kind of keeping under the radar that I was a problem child, I still had the respect of a lot of people because I was, keeping the ball under the water for the time being. But there was still a lot of substance misuse and low self-esteem and things. And, with my accident came a lot of time to reflect as well because back then there was no technology for people with disabilities. So you lay in bed a lot thinking about life and things, but especially after you've made choices you don't want to make. But all of this culminates to me coming up here to UAF, going through my classes, plugging through, and I take a rural development course. And I had this habit, I would do my homework at night, and at night everybody in my house is asleep, and I had this page turner where I would turn the page with this stick I would hold in my mouth. And that night my homework was to read this book called UAF. And I think I have a picture of it on the next. Yes, so this book, it's free, you can Google it. It's downloadable as a PDF, but this was the book that was assigned for that week. And this book changed my life. It's maybe 45, 50 pages if you don't read the letters that people wrote at the end of it. And when I read this book, I experienced two things. A lot of anger and a lot of hope. A lot of anger because up until that point, I was going through life thinking, I might end up dying by suicide. I might end up getting sexually assaulted. I might end up addicted to something. I might end up in a violent relationship. Maybe that's just who I might be because I'm Native, and that's what happens. And when I read this book, I realized that all of those things and those symptoms and those statistics that we were facing, that those were symptoms. Those weren't characteristics. So in the 50 pages of this book, Harold Napoleon tells the story of how his son died under his care while he was drinking. And he wrote this book while he was in prison. And he outlines accurate Alaska Native history, starting with 10,000 years ago. I remember when we started, and I asked you to just settle in your seat and imagine people out there harvesting, living off the land, governing, praying, creating, being scientists, all right out here outside our door. So he starts there, and he talks about how brilliant Indigenous people were living in one of the harshest climates in the world. And then he goes on to talk about contact and what had happened. And he talks about the epidemics, the flu epidemics, and describes how a family member might go back to their home and find their entire family passed away. And they don't have the resources or energy to properly bury them, and so they have to collapse their homes on top of their families and move. And then he talks about how when some missionaries came to Alaska, not all, but some missionaries, when they went out to the villages, they would tell people that the reason you are dying is because you're worshiping the devil, and if you worship our God, then you will be saved. And how were they saved? They would get the flu vaccine once they converted to Christianity. And so he also talks about many of the other atrocities that people faced, the boarding school era, which is where I'm going to pivot now, because once I learned about this, so I shared with you, I became very angry. Not angry at anybody, angry that nobody shared with me, angry that I went through life thinking that this is who I was. Because had I known that my ancestors were these brilliant people. I just figured Christopher Columbus found me just a little later than he found the people over on the East Coast. That was literally what I thought, what I learned in school, that was my understanding of history. And so in this book, when I learned that our ancestors were brilliant and we had all of these systems and ways to govern ourselves and survive in this climate, it also dawned on me that I was now empowered to do right and to take control of my life. Because if I wasn't maybe going to end up a statistic, then guess what? I get to choose what I get to do and who I get to be. And so it empowered me to take control and to start extracting from my community and to start adding value. But the other thing I really learned from that book was, if we lost so much of our culture in the time of boarding schools and flu epidemics and violence, then we can also start to relearn those things. And so that's when I say that it's difficult for some people to talk about traditional healing, is because traditional healing and our medicine people, they were people that were, the way we talk about it is we put our ways to sleep so they could be protected for now, so that when it was safe to bring them back out again, we could. And so it's still difficult for people to talk about, though, because of the taboo. So I just want to say that across Alaska, what I share with you now is not the experience of all people, all Indigenous people in relation to traditional healing. I just want to share that this is my own personal story. And it's a story that I love to share. And so what I decided after I learned of this was, let me back up a second. Have you ever learned something and you know how a pendulum on a clock goes? It goes way over here, then it goes way over here. But you learn something and you're just like, oh, I have to tell everybody. And you become the annoying pendulum, right? Where you're like way over here. Whether it's like Christianity, sobriety, whatever it is, like you're gonna tell the world because, oh my goodness, it has just changed you. Well, that was me with this book. And guess what? People were not really ready for me to be at that pendulum level. I had to back it up really quick, because the very first thing I thought was, this is why my grandma drinks. Because when I grew up, I grew up with an incredibly, beautifully strong, genius grandmother, the most kind. Like, her house was always 100 degrees. She always had a stack of pancakes on the table. She loved hard. It didn't matter who you were or what you did. She was going to love you no matter what. She had the biggest heart. She was also a tremendously difficult alcoholic who battled alcoholism until she died. And as soon as I read this book, I thought, my grandma has to know about this. This is going to help her. It's going to help her. I'm going to get her help. I'm going to help her heal. Because I had also heard stories that she had experienced. They were a lot of hushed stories that weren't talked about. And so when she came to Fairbanks, she sat at the edge of the bed, visiting me in my bedroom. And of course, I'm all eager. And I said, Grandma, I read this book. And she's like, oh. And I said, I'm telling her about it. And I tell her all about it. And she's just quiet, listening to me. And I said, did you ever experience anything like that, Grandma? And she just got quieter. And she looked down at her hands. And she said, I can't. And then she got up and walked out of the room. And she never talked about it. And I never got to see her go do all the healing I thought she was going to do. That was really hard when she passed. But I knew that I still had a story to learn and to heal from. And so I started asking my mom questions. Come on in, Jamie. So I started asking my mom questions and learned. Have some tea, please. And I learned that at the age of 9 years old, my mom had How many people are familiar with the boarding school history in Alaska? Anybody not familiar with it? I can give a quick, okay. So probably what most people are familiar with is that children were taken away to boarding school, right? That's not the case for all boarding school survivors. My mom was 9 years old and had heard about kids going to boarding school. She was in Kaikook at the time. She had heard about kids going to boarding school, and my grandfather was very violent in the home. And so she went to the priest and asked the priest to send her to boarding school. And so if you go to Pioneer Park today, Alaska Land, whichever you want to call it, if you go and you see the big stern wheeler there, at the age of 9 years old, my mom was put on that stern wheeler under the watch of the cook that she met that day, and she rode it from Kaikook to Nenana over 400 miles by river with a stranger. So think about a 9-year-old you might have in your life today, and imagine putting them even on a flight across the country with a stranger, right? She didn't return home again until she was 19. She went from Nenana Mission, where she says the Nenana Mission was like a heaven for her. She loved it. She remembers Christmases. In fact, a couple of years ago, we made a fruit cake to try to commemorate the Nenana Mission Christmas. Don't recommend fruit cake, still doesn't taste good, even if it's homemade. But we had fun doing it. She loved Nenana Mission. From there, she went to Wrangell. Wrangell was not a good experience. She witnessed a lot of abuse there. She will say that she was one of the lucky ones, that she was never the direct recipient of the abuse, but she would watch her cousins and friends be taken in the night, and she would see them be physically abused during the day. From there, she went to Mount Edgecombe. However, between Mount Edgecombe and Wrangell, they lost her for 2 days. She got off the plane in Ketchikan, I think, and they didn't make sure she got back on. So she was in Ketchikan for 2 days by herself, ended up babysitting for someone after they found her peeking in the window, and they took her in for 2 days, then she was found. They stuck her back on the plane. She got sent to Mount Edgecombe. And Mount Edgecombe also, she will say, she was one of the lucky ones. She saw a lot of abuse happen, a lot of terrible things happen, a lot of regalia burned from new students who would be showing up with their regalia from their families that had sent them to school. And then when she returned back home, she didn't fit in anymore. In fact, when she got off the plane in her home village, her little sister, who she had never met, thought she was the nurse because she thought she wasn't a Native person, and only a nurse would be non-Native. And so when her sister ran home and my grandma said, "Who got off the plane?" She said, "Oh, just the nurse." And then when my mom walked in the door, her little sister said, "What's the nurse doing here?" And she said, "That's your sister." And that was her introduction back home. But she struggled. And she still struggles today with fitting in. But she's amazing. At the age of 80 years old, she learned to do beadwork from a 90-year-old elder. That's traditional healing. So, I have 3 other siblings that I didn't grow up with. Tamara, Buddy, and Dana. They're all passed now. So my mom had 3 children, got them out of the house, and then had my sister and I. To this day, I don't know what she was thinking. I'm 48, and if I had an 8-year-old right now, you guys, I would not be up at 7 p.m. giving a lecture, I will tell you that. I would have said no to Michelle. So I had 3 siblings that were out of the house by the time my sister and I came around. Because my mom was raised by abusive dorm maids and missionaries, she didn't know how to be a loving mom. Thankfully, she went through a really long healing journey in the gap between those 3 children and my sister Tiffany and I, and did a lot of hard work. I always tell people, doesn't healing sound beautiful? Like, don't you guys all just want to heal? Like, it just sounds great, doesn't it? But I always tell people, like, healing is not beautiful. Healing is laying on the floor sometimes, ugly crying, to make it through that 5 minutes and then getting up and forcing yourself to go to work. Healing is sometimes pushing through the craving 1 minute at a time. Healing is sometimes having to forgive somebody who's hurt your feelings. You know, healing is hard work. And I'm so grateful to my mom for doing the healing she did, because I got to have that childhood I told you all about. And my house got to be a safe home for a lot of people. But I want to remind you that in my 20s, it all looked like I had it together, right? Remember, I was graduating, I had 4.0, I was on the dean's list, chancellor's list, I was getting job offers left and right. Things were going well. I met my husband-to-be, I got my house. I literally went from living in a low-income apartment with $800 a month, taking the bus to UAF, to getting a job, finding my partner, getting a wheelchair-accessible van, and moving into a house. That was one of the most stressful times in my life. I can't tell you that I really wanted to go back to that little low-income apartment for a while, because too much change is not good. So we'll just take that as a grain of salt to say, if that little bit of good change was hard for me, it's hard for me to imagine what the difficult changes our ancestors went through were, right? If good change can be hard for us, imagine all those hard historical changes. So I was a bit risky as a young adult. I became a mom at 27. I wasn't drinking regularly, but when I did drink, I drank too much every time. I would tell myself, like, I'm just gonna have 1 glass of wine. It would always be the whole bottle. I didn't know how to have 1 beer without having the whole 6-pack. I was still smoking cigarettes off and on, which was also very risky because my lungs were susceptible to pneumonia. Just a lot of risk-taking behaviors. And around the same time that I started getting tired of myself, I went to a conference in Anchorage and came across Rita Blumenstein, Dr. Rita Blumenstein, who is a traditional doctor. I didn't know who she was. I was sitting next to Lois Law, who is another traditional healer. I didn't know Lois Law was a traditional healer either. And in front of me, Rita Blumenstein turns around and she whispers something to Lois. And Lois turns to me and she says, Grandma Rita says I need to work on your left inner thigh, that's where the problem is. And I was like, I don't even know what that means. And she was like, you just have to trust Grandma Rita, she's a traditional doctor. And I was like, well, what are you gonna do to my left inner thigh? And she was like, it's just energy work. There's like something with energy that's affecting you. And I was like, okay, well, you know. So I also wanna let you know that my very first introduction to a traditional healer was when I was about 8 years old. I had the honor of cleaning house for a woman who was known as a medicine woman in our region. And second to her, my oldest sister, the one that had passed on, was a healer. She struggled a lot because of her childhood growing up, but she was a healer. And she would often offer to work on me. And my sister Tiffany, who I grew up with, we would always be like, oh, our hocus pocus sister, like, here she comes again, like, just go away, like, I'll lay here quietly while you do whatever, and, you know, it's not gonna work, so whatever, and she'd go, and nothing worked, and, you know, we would just make fun of her behind her back some more. So those were my 2 introductions, right, to healers so far, until I come across Grandma Rita and Lois, and so I let Lois work on me. The next day, I go back to a conference. I'm in a different meeting room. I'm across the room just like this, about as far from where Jamie is back there to me. And during the break, someone comes up to me and she says, hi, I just wanted to introduce myself to you. And I was like, oh, so we're talking. And she's like, have you ever heard of energy work? And I was like, yeah, actually just yesterday I did. And she said, there's something going on with you. She's like, I've been practicing Reiki for about 20 years, and I can tell something's off. She's like, would you mind if I just worked on you for a few minutes during the break? And at this point, you guys, I'm kind of like, I'm not even going to be weirded out. I'm just like, okay, go for it. So she does, and this time, something happens with my body. Like immediately when she hovers her hands over me, my body starts this like pulsing. And I can stop it if I want to, but I'm just kind of like paying attention to it. Like, okay, am I making this up in my head? Maybe I'm doing the shoulder roll, maybe. So I'm like trying to pay attention and figure it out in my head, all the while trying to like play it off that there's not a conference happening around me, and this woman is just working on me. And so she goes about her day, I go about my day. I have one more day at the conference tomorrow, the days go home, and I get invited that evening to an event at a friend's house. It was like some skincare product thing, right? And so we're at the skincare thing, we're all, washing our faces and stuff and eating these snacks, and this lady comes over to me that I don't know, and she says, I don't want to weird you out, but I'm a healer, and there's something going on with your energy. And I said, I know there is. When can you see me? I'll tell you what had happened before this, though. Before this, so while I pretend I had my life all together, I was also doing all of this volunteer work that had me looking like I had it all together in the Fairbanks community. I still do a lot of volunteer work together, and I do actually pretty much have it together now, I promise. But back then I didn't. I just had this facade going on. So I had gotten this email from First Alaskans Institute, and it said, da-da-da-da-da, we'd like to invite you to the Traditional Healers Gathering. We're inviting all healers to get together for 3 days. And I don't know if any of you know, but there's another Teisha Simmons in Fairbanks. She actually works for OCS. We have almost the exact same birthday. Almost everything in our lives is the same. And so I read it and I think, and she's also Alaska Native. So I read it and I think, wrong person. So I write back and I'm like, I'm sorry, but I think you meant to send this to the other Teisha Simmons. Here's her email address if you'd like to forward it to her. And they write back and they say, no, we meant to send it to you. And I'm like, well, that doesn't tell me much, but they meant to send it to me. So I write back and I say, I don't know anything about traditional healers or traditional healing, so I don't think this is the right event for me to be at. And she writes back and she says, you are a healer. She said, you bring people together in our community to do good things and to help others. She said, and traditionally, someone had that role in our tribes, that they would get people together to do community work. She said, and that's what we see you as. So it was at that event that I was talking with an individual, and I felt this pulsing in my body. So this is actually before I had the 3 people work on me in Anchorage, right? So I felt this pulsing in my body, and I was kind of like, man, something's up with my neck. And someone pops around my shoulder, and remember, I'm in this Airbnb. I think there's like 6 bedrooms and 50 healers in there. And I'm in this Airbnb with all these healers, and someone comes around and she says, it was Bev Joseph. If anybody knows Bev Joseph, she does energy work here in Fairbanks. And she says, I'm sorry, Teisha, I should have asked permission to work on you before I did. And it was because she worked on me and I didn't have my judgmental guard up like I had for my sister all those years, that it actually had an effect on me. And it was that pulsing that came back to me when those other healers in Anchorage started working on me. And it gets better, you guys. I'm not even kidding. So this goes on a couple of times. A couple of years go by, and I'm in Nashville for this conference, and I'm waiting for my Uber, and this lady's waiting for her Uber too, and we're just chit-chatting. And her Uber comes, and she's like, okay, well, I'll talk to you later. And she touches my shoulder, and immediately my body does it. And I look at her and I said, and in my mind, as quick as you can think, right? I'm like, okay, am I going to say something? Do I just let her go? I'll never see this lady again. I could just let it go by and I'll never see her again. Just let it go. But I say, I have a question for you. And she says, yeah. I said, do you practice any kind of alternative healing, energy work? I don't say traditional healing when I'm talking with non-native people because they won't really know what I'm talking about, So I'm like, any kind of energy work or Reiki or Eastern medicine? And she says, yeah, I'm actually a master Reiki practitioner. She said, why would you ask that? She said, we've just been talking for 5 minutes. And I said, because my body does something every time a healer touches me. And she said, I've never had that happen before. But I get the same experience, you guys, when I hear gospel music. I get the same experience when I pray now. Like my body has this immediate response every single time. So that's my story of how I got really introduced to traditional healing. There's a second level of this that I'll speed through quickly because we're running out of time. So I get on Facebook. This is just how life works, right? I'm sure you were all expecting to come to some very academic, outlined, bulleted PowerPoint with like steps on how to do something. This is just real life, okay? So I get on Facebook, and it's right before the TCC convention, which is where our delegates vote on all things business. And I say, I wish a delegate would put forth a resolution to start traditional healing at Chief Andrew Isaac Health Center, and that's all I say. And then everybody's like, well, what is that? Oh, me too. Oh, I've had healing working. Probably 100 comments. And in one of those comments, somebody says, I have grant money that has funding for traditional healing activities, and we have no idea what to do with it. She said, could you please call me on Monday? And so I'm like, I don't know if I'm your person, but I'm going to pretend I'm your person. So, because I'm still learning myself, right? And so I call her up, and she says, yeah, we've had this money. We're on a no-cost extension. We've got to spend it. You know, do you have any ideas? And I said, well, let me check with some elders. Let me talk with elders and just come back. I said, in all honesty, all I know is what has worked for me as an individual. I said, I would have no idea what to do with all this money you have. I said, but let me talk with elders. And so what I found, what the elders shared with me, was exactly what Rita Blumenstein has said before, and I'll share the quote at the end. But what they said was, every single time you are doing something to learn more about who you are as a Native person, every single time you are practicing one of our traditions, every single time you are speaking a word of our language, that is traditional healing. And so what they advised us to do was think of the traditional practices that we're losing and get 100 people together who are helpers, who are clients, who are educators, and teach them from our elders. And so we had a 3-day event where we had language workshops. Oh, I have some slides. Could you go to the next slide? So we had so I want to share this photo. So that's my grandmother that I told you about, my mother, me when I had the facade of having it all together, and then my little girl who to this day doesn't know what trauma is, and is so beautiful. I've never had to have the talk with her that my mom had to have the talk with me as a little girl so much. It's been amazing. Go ahead. So language revitalization. So we had language workshops where we had language games. People learned how to introduce themselves in their language. So we had 6 different languages represented. We had language learning materials available for people. And so a lot of just fun activities. There was a lot of like movements, kids games, like musical chairs, think with adults games, but in Athabascan, those kinds of things. Go ahead. We have traditional knowledge. So on the left-hand side there, that's my nephew Trevor, and that's Susan Pascavan. Her mom is the author of the Danaka Dictionary, the Koikan Athabascan Dictionary, Eliza Jones. And in that photo there, Susan is working with Trevor to trace his ancestral lineage. And I think they went as far back as the early 1800s. And she chose about 8 different names that he could select from his family members. And my nephew, he's been navigating life lately. And that was a really meaningful event for him to go through, a rite of passage for him. And he's wearing that name so proudly. It's carrying him so well now. On the right there, we started having elder gatherings. So I host regular elder dinners at my house because for me, traditional healing is learning as much traditional knowledge as I can. So something I always ask at our elder gatherings is, what is something you wish we would do as young people? Or what is something you don't see happening anymore that you want us to start to do? Or what's the advice you have for us this year? So we just ask our elders for their knowledge and for them to share. And we ask for their stories. And it's so amazing because so often our elders will say, like, well, I don't really have anything to share. But then or they'll say, I don't really know about any of that kind of stuff. And then I'll say something like, tell me about when you had your first child. And the lessons I can get from that one story are phenomenal. Okay. So focusing on language, focusing on traditional knowledge, focusing on song revitalization. That group on the left, that's the Dene Slan group here in Fairbanks. We're an intertribal group. We're really focused on bringing back songs that haven't been sung in decades. Some of the songs we're learning right now are hundreds of years old. Dr. Jessica Black, she's a dance group member in the group, and one night we were practicing right over in Brooks, and we left the Brooks building, and she texted me. We were on our way home, and she said, are we humans or are we spirits? Because it was so spiritual, that singing and drumming for that 2 hours. It was like we were not even in the Brooks building. It was amazing. That top right photo is when my grandmother passed away. I couldn't bead or sew in her honor for her memorial potlatch. So what I decided, I asked my other grandmother, and she said, you need to learn some songs to be able to sing at her potlatch. She said, and you need to make her a song, a grieving song. And so that photo on the top right is my mom giving me a hug after I sang my grandma's grieving song for her at her memorial potlatch. And the bottom right, that photo was just taken this last year. There was a young man that passed away, a fairly young man. That little boy in the photo, that's Ben. He's from Fort Yukon. His mom, Melinda, said I could share this story, but Ben's brother passed away, and they came to Fairbanks, and they were having the funeral potlatch. That was the singing and the drumming that was happening at the funeral potlatch. That was the first time Ben had been to drumming and singing like that. And when he got off the dance floor, he went up to his mom, and he said, that was the best thing ever, Mom. I've never felt so alive in my life. That's traditional healing. To be at your big brother's funeral and to say you've never felt more alive in your life. Okay. Traditional arts and practices. This is a big one for so many ways, and we're seeing it be incorporated into so many of our meetings. There's a lot of indigenizing of our meetings and conferences happening. But in that left-hand photo, one of the things our elders said was, we have so many traditional practices that we're not doing anymore. So the left-hand one that's my oldest sister, Tiffany. She's making a fishnet by hand. So we used to watch my late grandfather mend fishnets every summer, but we never knew how to do it right. And so that's where she learned to make and mend a fishnet. The middle picture is an elder teaching a young lady how to make nanothlada, which is fish ice cream. It's ice cream made out of very, very dried fish, boiled fish, white fish, and then mixed with berries and moose fat and sugar. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see elders and young adults working together to make drums for themselves. Go ahead. On the left-hand side, in Huslia, we did a traditional healing event there. You can see the young men there. They're cutting out to make their own beaver hats. We also had martin hat making, nanothlada making. You can see on the right-hand side, that's caribou tufting. So about 40 people learned how to do caribou tufting for earrings and necklaces. Other things that we learned were birch bark basket making. Young men went out and set beaver sets with the older men. And so it was so neat to see, because at the end of the 3 days, the young men showed up at Curtis's home, and they were like, when can we go out again? And so just those natural relationships were even being built, and that's traditional healing. And then living with the land. So you can see on the right-hand side, that's Curtis that I was telling you about, Curtis Agnes, and he's teaching a young man how to butcher a beaver that they had taught those young men how to set those beaver sets just in the couple days before. The middle photo, they're teaching some young ladies how to cut up a fish. And then on the left-hand side, the men were having a men's gathering where the men were imparting knowledge onto the young men and teaching them before they go out onto the land how to be respectful. And then we also incorporated traditional healers. And this is probably the part that everybody thinks they're going to hear about whenever I talk about traditional healing. But what we did was we got a group of healers together, and the one here, the photos you're seeing, this was in Huslia at the school, but we also had an event here in Fairbanks where we had the very back room of the Wedgwood, and it was, all the lights were off back there, and it was like all low lighting with some really nice music playing, and we had about 8 healers that were working on people over the 3 days of the conference. And at first, on the first day, people weren't signing up. They were kind of like going and looking at the sign and like, I don't know, like, am I going to get in trouble if I go in that room? I'm nervous, I'm scared. Some people were like, oh, sign me up, I'm all in for it, you know. It's kind of like a roller coaster. You're either like, I'm in or I'm out. And so a lot of the people, though, over the 3 days, they would see people come out of the healing room, and they'd be like, man, you look so relaxed. And so we had energy workers, body workers, we had circle talking. The young lady in the blue cuspuk at the end, she's a traditional doctor apprentice, so she does about 7 different treatment modalities. We had an acupuncturist, so you can see on the upper right-hand corner. We only got a photo of people getting acupuncture done because the other healing modalities are a bit more intimate. And so you can see an elder there. That was on the 3rd day. She was so curious about acupuncture, and she had a lot of pain in her hands. And she really wanted to try it, but she was so nervous. And so I walked down to the healing area with her, and she held my hand the entire way to the healing room. And there she is getting her treatment. And then in the middle photo is a talking circle that was happening as well. And so it's really like a multi-layered approach for myself personally that I see it, because the way I see it is that, and the research shows that when we have strong cultural identity, we have better well-being. And so when we are allowed, not just myself as an Indigenous woman, when each of you is allowed to be truly who you are, that is when we are our healthiest, right? When we can practice our lives as we want to practice them, that's when we're happy. We're not going to be happy when people come in and say, take our food and our ceremonies or our languages away, right? None of us would be happy with that. And so there's a lot of healing that's to be done. And I'm going to share one more slide, I think. Oh, and then gathering in community. So just getting together in community is healing. And so we do a lot of intentional gatherings here in Fairbanks, especially. You know, our villages, they get together all the time just naturally because that's the way villages operate. But here in Fairbanks, for a long time, we weren't getting together and doing fun things. About 25 years ago, FNA hosted the very first Halloween carnival, village style. There were about 500 people that showed up at the tribal hall, and we heard comments all night where people said, I haven't experienced Halloween like this since I moved away from my village 30 years ago. I can't believe we're doing village Halloween in Fairbanks. They were so excited. So getting together in community. So you see the elder dinner on the bottom again, and then on the upper right, Dr. Reverend Anna Frank, and that's my mom on the right-hand side, visiting. They've been best friends and being healers to each other for all of their friendship. Go ahead. So where do we go from here? And this is a quote from Dr. Rita Pica-Blumenstein, one of our traditional doctors. She's passed on now. She says, when we heal ourselves, we also heal our ancestors, our grandmothers, our grandfathers, and our children. And that photo on the right is my grandmother holding my daughter's hand. And so guess what? My grandma does get to heal because I'm healing. Because my daughter's going to keep healing. So she gets to heal too. Thank you all for being a part of my story. I feel really honored to share this space with you.
Thank you so much, Teisha. And if traditional healing involves all those arts and crafts, count me in. Do you have any questions from the audience or comments? or Teisha? Yes. Did you raise your hand?
Yeah. Hey, Teisha.
Hi.
Haven't seen you for a long time, but I try to touch base now and then. I want to hear about what you're doing. I met you probably not too long after, when you got back to town after your accident and stuff a long time ago. But
Angry Teisha.
yes, you were. You were very much so. But my question is, I heard recently from another friend of mine that her interpretation was that there was some new healing group or something happening with some of the Native folks here in town. When I hear you talk, I think it may be new to her awareness, but it's not necessarily new. But some of the trying to use movement and trying to use some of the energy work and that kind of stuff. Has there been an uptick in that, even more than this gradual thing?
I would say that since the first traditional healing gathering that happened in October 2022, that's when a shift really started happening and where people started saying, instead of like Western curriculum, we want to talk about healthy relationships out beaver setting. We want to talk about healthy relationships while we're doing beadwork together, We don't want to do it in a office space. And so I think that it's being incorporated and integrated more. And then I know Chief Andrew Isaac is in the process of setting up their traditional healing clinic as well. And then there's also Norton Sound Health Corporation. They have a traditional healing clinic. So a lot of the healers, when I got invited to that 3-day gathering at the Airbnb, a lot of their healers from that region came to Fairbanks as well. So yeah, I would say across the state, and every region is in its various, some regions have been doing it for a long time, and some are just starting to talk about it, and everybody's at their own pace.
Thank you, Mrs. Gannon. Any other questions or comments from the crowd?
I'll make a comment.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, that years ago I met your mom when I was 17. I think she was probably the grand old age, 20 or something like that, but she was older than I was. She lived across the street. And where the borough building is now, I was talking earlier about where things were, where the now used to be Barry's Trailer Court. And we lived along the river, and we hadn't met until then, but we both had similar life experiences up to that point, and we just very quickly became very, very close friends. And I am really thrilled to be here tonight to listen to you talk about your mother, your grandmother, all that. My husband can tell you, I constantly talk about my grandmother. My grandmother was from Guadalupe, and I'm in the back, and my name is Abak. I truly don't know how I would have been able to accomplish any of the things that I've done in this community if it hadn't been for my grandmother. That my husband and I have McCafferty's. That's my grandmother's maiden name. And she's still always with me no matter what or where. I learned so many things from her, and it's really refreshing to hear you talk about that similar experience of memories of your family, because it's very difficult. I think a lot of you in the room know that I serve on 17 committees, and there's so much work to be done, so much. And if we can value the experiences that are right there around us, in front of us, beside us all the time, but that we're not availing ourselves of those experiences, if we can be conscious of the actuality of help that's there and available to us by just being part of the understanding. And so thank you so much for being here tonight.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Well, I'd like to remind everybody that we have speakers every Wednesday night for Discover Alaska series, except July 2nd. And we'll be going till mid-August, August 18th, I think it is. So hope to see you again, everybody, and have a great night.